Hey everyone, Soap mentioned from the Darwin Digest here. I've been meaning to start putting together videos for a while now, and since everyone's talking about the Syria attacks right now, I thought I would chime in with some quick thoughts regarding the white helmet's use of PPE, that's personal protective equipment, or rather their lack of it. If you've been paying attention to Syria over the last few years, you would have noticed quite a few chemical weapons attacks, mostly sarin or chlorine, that the white helmets have claimed to be the responders to. Up until now, the most well-known was the 2013 attack outside of Damascus, which was famously found to be orchestrated by the rebels rather than by the Syrian government. And if the claims of the white helmets are true, then there's been many more in between. As an organization whose main focus is responding to and providing medical assistance to the victims of attacks, both conventional and chemical, it would stand to reason that they would place some emphasis on providing the correct PPE for their workers. You would assume that this would be something they would invest a decent part of their budget into. If they can't necessarily get the exact equipment that standards recommend, then they would be able to find suitable substitutes. Because their workers need them in the event of the sort of chemical attack that they maintain and they respond to on a semi-regular basis. However, when we look at photos of the rescue response, we see very little evidence of this. And there are two questions to answer. The first is, what is the recommended equipment? And the second is, how important is the recommended PPE in regards to exposure to sarin gas in particular? Anyone who's worked in industry knows that safety regulations are often, and the recommended safety equipment is often way too high for what you actually deal with. It's kind of like a, let's be the safest possible. And in regards to exposure to chemicals of these sort of nature, they tend to go overboard with these sort of things to be 100% certain. So, it's a good idea to sort of understand exactly how important it is to keep yourself from being exposed to particular things. Anyway, to answer the first question, I'm going to reference the Physicians for Human Rights Chemical Weapons fact sheet for sarin gas and the CDC's National Institute for Occupational Health and Safety website list of PPE. In essence, the most important thing that PPE does, obviously, is it isolates the skin and air intake from exposure. Sarin gas is extremely effective at low doses and is fast-acting. As such, it's vitally important that responders are protected from the agent, so they don't pass out and start seizing in the middle of a rescue. In this first photo, we see responders handling sarin victims whilst wearing gas masks. The particular gas masks they're using are air purifying. So, assuming they have the correct filter, which obviously they're likely to, and if they've got the correct filter installed, then these will prevent the wearer from breathing in aerosolized or gaseous sarin. However, they're not wearing gloves, except for one. I'll get to them in a moment though. Yeah, so they're not wearing any gloves as they're decontaminating the victims of sarin exposure. And if sarin is present, they're getting exposed. They're washing down these victims, and at the same time, they're rubbing bare hands all over them. That's not very smart. The one pair of gloves present in the picture appears to be like workman's gloves, the type they use to prevent abrasions, gardening gloves. It's definitely not leather or surgical. And if it's a normal workshop style glove, then it would provide exactly zero protective effect to the rescuers, and in fact would be likely to hold the sarin against his skin more so than do anything else. Yeah, that's not good. The responder with the hose is also wearing a second type of mask we can see more clearly in the next photo. And this particular type of mask is called a particulate respirator. This type you see in hospitals and such. Hospitals got to be effective. Well, they are really effective at filtering infectious agents such as bacteria or fungi. However, they offer zero defense against chemical agents, which are a lot smaller. In the case of the hospital, it can kind of be explained away. Face masks in hospital so you don't spread things like the flu, especially in such a crowded area, which that would appear to be an intake, obviously is. But then why is the first guy wearing one? And why don't doctors have a high level of protection for themselves? And there are other photos of, I'll put a couple of screenshots up now, of them wearing the same particulate mask whilst out in the field. So that it's bit sus there. It's not offering them any protection. Or how important is... So obviously they're not wearing PPE. They're the correct PPE, and they're obviously getting exposed. So how important is the correct PPE? To do this, to examine how important it is, I'm going to be referencing fairly heavily from a few papers that studied the response to the Tokyo subway attacks. I'll be reading from Run 1, and I've drawn my conclusions from the others, and links are all in the description. So first, some background. The 20th of March 1995, Tokyo subway was attacked with sarin gas, killing 12 people and injuring more than 4,000. The gas was released by a cult, and whilst the tragedy does provide us with an ideal case study to draw some comparisons to, this is especially true since the first responders and doctors who attended both the attack site and the two hospitals victims were sent to also lacked the correct level of PPE. Sarin gas that was used on the subway was only about 30% pure, which along with the terrorists' failure to derive an effective delivery method goes a long way to explain their lack of casualties. When comparing the two events, which I'm about to do obviously, the delivery is broadly irrelevant in terms of the effects on the responders and medical staff, as I'm going to be focusing on secondary transmission, that is someone who's been infected via primary transmission, at the attack site, and then spreading it to others. Purity, however, is important because the sarin used in Syria would be much more potent. Weapons made by military as a weapon, as opposed to cooking it up in your bathtub at home. And it follows because it's so much more. The Syrian one would be so much more pure. It follows that the effect on responders in Syria would be much larger. From Clinical Review, Tokyo protecting healthcare worker during a chemical mass casualty event, an important issue of continuing relevance. I quote, "No primary decontamination was performed at the scene of the Tokyo subway sarin attack. In addition, the first responders and healthcare workers involved in the initial response were not wearing personal protective equipment. As a result, 135, 9.9% of the 1,364 fire department personnel who responded to the incident experienced secondary exposure whilst transporting victims to emergency facilities." The primary decontamination referenced in that passage is it can be seen in the first photo that I put up again. As a quick note regarding the decontamination, just the process in regards to this, in the foreground, the white helmet removing the shirt of the child, and the green shirt, he appears to be pulling it over his head, and this is a really bad idea. You're basically rubbing sarin and any sarin in the shirt all over the kid's face, and most importantly over their eyes and nose, which will dramatically increases the likelihood of a fatal dose being administered. Every resource that I could find that mentions decontamination and goes into a bit of detail about it insisted that the respondent cut off any article of clothing that had to be removed over the head and rather than what appears to be happening in this picture. Anyway, the picture appears to be like I said, primary decontamination, like on site, get as much sarin off as possible, get in the hospital. And if that's the case, we could expect that, like the fire department, who was not wearing correct PPE, although fire department, you'd think they'd have gloves as opposed to these guys, 9.9% of the fire departments was affected. You could expect that at least 10% of the white helmets are going to be exposed. Once again, I'd like to emphasize that this is an organization that main focus is dealing with attacks like these on a semi-regular basis, usually conventional, but like they should be prepared for the chemical weapons attacks that they talk about so much. And can they really afford to have 10% of their workers fall ill and potentially die every time a chemical weapon is deployed? And if chemical weapons are deployed 5-6 times a year, like they claim, that's an attrition rate of 60% a year. Well, no, it won't be because they won't all die, but it's a 60% of their workers are going to fall ill to sarin gas and potentially die every year. Doesn't sound quite right there. Anyway, continuing from the same paper. In the Tokyo subway attack, secondary exposure also occurred at medical facilities. As a result of the proximity to the subway station where many of the victims were exposed to the agent, St. Luke's International Hospital received 640 victims on the day of the incident. A survey conducted at St. Luke's after the incident found that 23% of the hospital staff experienced secondary exposure, The rates of exposure by occupation were 39.3% in nursing assistants, 26.5% in nurses, 25.5% in volunteers, 21.8% in doctors, and 18.2% in clerks. It's thus apparent that the extent of secondary exposure amongst individuals increased in proportion to the duration and degree of physical contact they had with the victims. The rate of secondary exposure at various locations was 45.8% at the hospital chapel, 38.7% in the intensive care unit, ICU, 32.4% in the outpatient department, 17.7% in the ward, and 16.7% in the emergency department. The low number of individuals who experienced secondary exposure in the emergency department was attributed to the fact that the staff in the area were breathing outdoor air, and the ventilation in the department was extraordinarily high, given that the automatic doors at the ambulance entrance were often open because of the continuous arrival of victims. Conversely, the high incidence of secondary exposure in the chapel was attributed to the fact that the air circulation in the chapel had never been good, and because many of the victims were received there. Okay, so pictures of the hospital in Syria that I could confirm were from the 4th, were hard to find, but this one is the one wider shot that I could actually guarantee that was from the hospital, or could see that was from the hospital on the date. So really this is the only one I've got that's good for it. But if it is, it also appears to be the intake, because you can see the outside, and if it's representative of the high traffic areas, it's a good contrast to the chapel, in particular in the 1995 attack. Not necessarily the emergency department, because whilst it does have access to the open air, you can tell it's quite an enclosed area as opposed to hospital emergency wards, modern hospital emergency wards in the civilized world. A lot more open space, so there's a lot more airflow. Clearly here that's not the case. It's very enclosed. Anyway, so yeah, it's a good contrast to the chapel, more so than anywhere else. Possibly the outpatient area, but maybe not. Anyway, so during the subway attack, the hospital chapel was used as a triage overflow due to the number of victims. That's why there were people there. And yeah, but so let's not just say that it's going to be 1-to-1, because obviously not going to be. And you'll give a bit of benefit of doubt here and not take the highest exposure rate, although we do, like I said, we do have some reason to. And instead, let's just go with the broadest possible. The exposure rate will be somewhere likely between 45.8 and 16.7%. On the high end, that's almost half of the healthcare staff showing signs of secondary exposure. And don't forget the sarin used in Syria will be much more potent than that used in Tokyo. But what about that primary decontamination? It would lower the exposure rates dramatically, and there is indeed footage of what appears to be the washing down of children and adults. I'm not going to play any of it because don't want this video shut down because there are what I claim to be corpses in the background. So yeah, let's not get my YouTube account shut down on my first video. But they're all available, just any news article basically. But those videos, and as well as all the pictures like this one, show that not all the clothes are removed. They're always wearing pants. Pants are impervious to sarin, I guess. Yeah, the point is, obviously, contaminated material is still being brought into the hospital. So even if they don't have the time to do a proper decontamination or whatever, like if there's a legitimate reason why, like they're still coming in with contaminated material. So the hospital is going to be, as a focal point for all of these, as a point where all of these victims go to receive treatment. There's going to be a lot of secondary exposure at the hospital, and yeah, it just doesn't compute. You would think they would actually strip them off. There's video. Basically, they're not following the proper procedure, as it were. I guess I can make another video on that, but it will be longer, a bit more complicated to do as well. So yeah, it might take me a while. But if people are interested, let me know and I'll do it. Anyway, to wrap things up before I completely go off on a rant about something else, The 1995 Tokyo subway attacks are a good baseline that we can use to see the base level of, or not base level, to see a analogous level of exposure that first responders and healthcare staff will be exposed to given a lack of PPE. And it's quite high, obviously. In the case of the Tokyo, no first responder was actually killed. All healthcare staff was actually killed because of the attack, but like I said before, the purity was much, much lower than what would have been in Syria. So this, should be really surprising given the level of expertise that the White Helps must have accrued during their history of dealing with similar attacks, which is a bit sus. Does this prove that the chemical attack was faked? No, it's only circumstantial evidence. It does, however, raise some fairly serious questions in regards to the attack. Anyway, so that's kind of what I just wanted to point out there, is like there should be, a lot more sick white hats. Or there should be, at the very least, there should be, you would think they have some level of expertise. There's pictures of Turkish experts in the area wearing the correct PPE. I'll put that picture up. Anyway, so that's that. It just doesn't really click very well. Anyway, if you guys like this sort of video, let me know. I'll keep making them whenever something interesting like this pops up. If you want me to do the video on procedure, then I'll do that as well. And don't forget to check out the Darwin Digest on SoundCloud. Anyway, that's it. So see you next time.